So this is going to be the last video of the chapter. We're going to go ahead and wrap up the chapter now. Man, it's been a long chapter and it's covered a lot of stuff. We started with everything from the barter economy to the monetary economy to figuring out planned consumption, planned investment, and then planned savings, things of that nature. We use that to build up the aggregate expenditures function. We use that aggregate expenditures function in finding that nation's product market equilibrium using the Keynesian cross. We use that to start building into our aggregate demand. Our aggregate demand is then used in our aggregate supply to find in a different way, the nation's product market equilibrium again. And then we started using this aggregate supply to define about full employment and things of that nature. And now we're going to actually finish it off by talking about inflationary and recessionary gaps. So what is an inflationary gap? An inflationary gap is the actual gap is the amount that the equilibrium, the nation's product market equilibrium output, that is greater than the level of full employment. So if you look down here at our graphs, we have the nation's equilibrium is right there. We can see that that's where the aggregate demand curve crosses the aggregate supply curve, meaning that that is the point where the amount that is being supplied is the amount being demanded, and we can basically clear the table. And that's our nation's equilibrium. But down here we have the nation's full employment. So the full employment price would be here, but the nation's equilibrium is actually right there. Well, that distance between the equilibrium and the full employment, when equilibrium is greater than the full employment, that is our inflationary gap. It's the inflationary gap is equal to the equilibrium output minus the full employment output when the equilibrium is greater than the full employment output. That's when aggregate expenditures is greater than full employment output. So what does that look like in an economy? What if we are in this inflationary gap? What if we're in this inflationary aspect within an economy? What does that look like? Well, that looks like everybody's working. And not only is everybody working, but a lot of people are putting in overtime, are doing double shifts. And even though everybody's working happy, everybody's making a lot of money, they're working harder. The prices are increasing, so it's allowing those businesses to hire people on for multiple shifts, and they're willing to pay overtime, and they're willing to work them longer hours, and the workers are willing to work longer hours because they're getting compensated for it, and they're getting compensated for it through these higher price levels. Because the people are willing to pay more, they're being paid, the workers are being paid more. Because consumers are willing to pay more, the consumers are being paid more, so they're willing to produce more. So what does that do? Well, if people are making more money as a whole in the whole United States, the whole nation, the whole economy, they're willing to spend more, which is indicative of this higher aggregate demand, which means that the price level is going up, which means we're having this inflation going on within the nation because people are willing to work so much more and willing to get paid so much more. We have this inflationary gap. But simply put, this inflationary gap is when the aggregate equilibrium output, the aggregate output equilibrium is greater than the output at full employment when equilibrium is greater than full employment. On the other hand, we have this recessionary gap. More or less along the same lines, it's a mirror image of the inflationary gap. It's the amount, that gap is the amount that the equilibrium is less than full employment. So this recessionary gap is when the economy could produce at YE without much inflation, or YFE. So what that means is we're not at full employment. And we can see down here, here's full employment, and here is equilibrium. This particular economy right here is not even operating at full employment. And if we did operate at full employment, look at how much prices would have changed. A very small amount, whereas if you compare it to this particular graph, where prices are increasing by a larger amount. So this was this inflationary gap. And this is our recessionary gap. And what it's saying is the economy could hire a few more people and work at this full employment without a large increases in prices. What's happening is because we are not operating at full employment, fewer people are employed. So what does this economy look like? Well, this economy looks like prices are relatively low. The general price level is low, which is great, especially for those that are working. But there aren't as many people working. We're not at full employment. And if that aggregate demand would increase to right here at this full employment, we wouldn't see a large increase in prices, but we'd see a lot more people working. We'd see, employment is now full. So how do we calculate a recessionary gap? Well, the recessionary gap is the full employment output minus the equilibrium output when equilibrium is less than full employment. It's the distance between here and here, whereas our inflationary gap is the distance between full employment and equilibrium whenever equilibrium is beyond full employment. Here it's the distance between equilibrium and full employment when full employment is is at a greater output than equilibrium. So one last final note. As aggregate demand increases, we see that equilibrium will move up the supply curve. We have a movement along the supply curve as aggregate demand shifts. So past the point of full employment output, we see further increases in the general price level, and that increase in the general price level is going to increase more than the general output. So once we get past this full employment aspect, we're going to see price levels continuously increase, and they're increasing at a faster rate than what output is increasing. Whereas below this full employment level, we see that as, say, aggregate demand increases up into that point, we're seeing that output increases faster than the price level does.